The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, there was an old shoemaker who worked and lived in a small shop in a tiny village. The shoemaker was known throughout the town as a kind and generous man. He made a point to help the hungry and needy as he came upon them, believing with his whole heart that they crossed his path for a reason. After a series of unfortunate events, the shoemaker found himself in a time of need. He had become very poor and barely had enough money to feed himself or his wife. All he had left in his possession was enough leather to make one final pair of shoes. If he couldn't sell the shoes, he and his wife would lose the shop and live on the streets. And with winter fast approaching, he worried how they would survive. The shoemaker was so exhausted from worry, he decided to go to bed early. He cut the leather into pieces, laid the pieces out on his work table, and planned to make the shoes first thing in the morning. The following day, the shoemaker awoke early, eager to get started on the shoes. To his amazement, a pair of perfectly sewn leather shoes was waiting for him on his work table. Someone else had made the shoes for him. The shoemaker examined every inch of the shoes. Each piece of leather had been sewn together flawlessly. They were far better than the shoes he made, perhaps the nicest pair that he had ever seen. "Honey, come look at this," he called to his wife. "What a lovely pair of shoes you've made," she said sweetly. "But I didn't make them," the shoemaker said. "I left the pieces on the table last night and then woke this morning to find they had been made without me." "You silly old fool," his wife said and pinched his cheek. "It'll take more than that to trick me." The shoemaker didn't press the matter any further. Had the positions been reversed, he probably wouldn't have believed it either. The shoes were both a miracle and a mystery. He had wished he had some place to direct his gratitude. He placed the leather shoes in the window of his store, and they caught the attention of the first man who walked by. The man was so attracted to the shoes, he went inside to inquire about purchasing them. "How on earth did you make such a beautiful pair of shoes?" the man asked. "I've never seen stitching that fine in my life." "I wish I knew," the shoemaker said with a shrug. "I appreciate a man who keeps his business secrets to himself," the man said. "Name your price. I simply must have them." The man gave the shoemaker enough money to live off for another week and buy enough leather to make 2 new pairs of shoes. Not expecting the miracle to happen twice, the shoemaker cut the leather into the pieces he needed and went to work on them. His old hands weren't what they used to be, and his joints ached with arthritis. So the shoemaker went to bed and planned on coming back to the project in the morning. The next day, the shoemaker walked into a shop only to find that another mysterious miracle had occurred while he slept. 2 pairs of impeccably sewn leather shoes had been put together without him. "Honey, come look at this," the shoemaker called to his wife. "What lovely pairs of shoes," she said. "They're just as nice as the pair you made before." "That's what I'm trying to tell you," the shoemaker said. "I didn't make these shoes, and I certainly didn't make the pair from the night before." His wife knew exactly how long it took her husband to make a single pair of shoes. It was unlikely he could make 1 pair overnight, let alone 2. "Just because you're an old dog doesn't mean you can't learn new tricks," she convinced herself. "Now stop teasing me with this foolishness, or I'll take you to see a doctor." "Trust me, if we could afford a doctor, I would have taken myself already," the shoemaker said. He placed the new shoes in his store window, and both pairs sold for even better prices than the day before. The shoemaker had enough money to eat for another week and enough left over to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. Things took such a turn for the better, the shoemaker was starting to feel guilty. He still had no clue who or what had been helping him. That night, he cut the leather into pieces to make 4 pairs of shoes. Business was so great that there was no rush to finish them, so the shoemaker went to bed as soon as he finished dinner. You'd have thought the old man would be used to it by now, but the next morning he was just as amazed as ever to find 4 new pairs of shoes on his work table. "Honey, come see this," the shoemaker said to his wife, "and this time you'll have to believe me." Now, the shoemaker's wife had gone to bed much later than her husband the previous night. She had seen the leather pieces on the table with her own eyes and knew that the shoemaker couldn't have made the shoes himself. "Well, bless my soul," his wife said. "Who could have done this?" "I don't know, but we must find out so I can thank them," the shoemaker said. Once the new shoes were sold, the shoemaker purchased enough leather to make 8 pairs of shoes. That night he cut the leather into pieces and laid them out on his work table. He and his wife hid in the doorway and anxiously waited for the help to arrive. They waited and waited, but nothing happened. "Perhaps they've taken the night off," the shoemaker suggested. Just then the leather pieces began moving on their own at the work table. It was as if 2 invisible hands were sewing the shoes together. "It's a spirit," the shoemaker whispered to his wife. "The shoes aren't being constructed by a spirit, they're being made by elves," his wife said. "Your eyes aren't what they used to be. Here, take my glasses and see for yourself." The shoemaker's wife handed her husband her glasses. There were 2 elves making the shoes at his work table, and they were so small he couldn't see them from the doorway. Each elf did the work of one human hand using its entire body, all while completely naked. "The poor dears," the shoemaker's wife said. "They must be freezing. Tomorrow I'll knit them both a wardrobe as a way of saying thank you." The next day, the 8 new pairs of leather shoes sold even more quickly than the previous pairs. It would be a very long while before the shoemaker had to worry about poverty again. That night, instead of laying out 2 pieces of leather for the elves, the shoemaker's wife laid out 2 tiny hats, 2 scarves, 2 pairs of pants, 2 pairs of socks, and 2 sweaters she had knitted during the day. The shoemaker even crafted 2 pairs of tiny boots for the elves to wear. They hid in the doorway like before and waited for the elves to arrive. When the elves appeared on the work table, the shoemaker and his wife couldn't believe their eyes. However, the elves didn't try on any of the clothes as expected. On the contrary, they tiptoed around the clothes as if they were afraid of them. "Go on," the shoemaker said. "We made them for you. We can't thank you enough for helping us." The elves were startled to see that the shoemaker and his wife had been watching them. "You mean it's a gift?" the first elf asked. "Of course it is," the shoemaker's wife said. "I don't know anyone else they'd fit." "But to give an elf an article of clothing is to give him his freedom," the second elf said. "We would never have to make another pair of shoes for you again." The shoemaker and his wife had no idea the gesture would imply so much, but since it was the right thing to do, they didn't hesitate. "You've done quite enough for us," the old shoemaker said. "We'd be happy to give you freedom." The elves erupted into high-pitched cheers. They had been slaves to mankind all their lives and had never thought this day would come. "Why did you start helping me in the first place?" the shoemaker asked the elves. "We used to belong to another man in the village, one you had helped get back on his feet a long time ago," the first elf said. "When he died, he told us to look after you." "My word," the wife said. "Kindness certainly goes around, even if it doesn't come back to you right away." The elves dressed in their new warm clothes and left the shop. The shoemaker and his wife never saw them again. Years later, the old shoemaker fell on hard times once more. He ran out of money and feared that he and his wife would be kicked out onto the street. Even though his hands were crippled with arthritis, the old shoemaker cut leather pieces to make a pair of shoes with the last bit of material that he had left. It was all his poor hands could handle for the night, so he retired early. Miraculously, when the shoemaker awoke the next day, he found a pair of perfectly sewn shoes waiting for him. Even though they were freed, the elves were so thankful for the kindness of the shoemaker and his wife that they returned and offered him a helping hand whenever he needed one. The elves enjoyed their freedom, and they made sure the shoemaker and his wife enjoyed a happily ever after. The end.